So I've got Dr. Peter J. Williams, author of Can We Trust the Gospels, with us. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
I was thinking about you the other day because I did a video on slavery, and I spoke about the fact that perhaps the Hebrew word for slavery, eved, could be sort of translated bond servant and that sort of thing. And I made that kind of film, and I said the Old Testament practice of slavery was very different from the New Testament, so Greco-Roman practice of slavery, the first century Greco-Roman practice, which was very different again from the chattel slavery of the transatlantic slave trade. And I got a bit of pushback on it, in particular on the issue of Old Testament slavery, and many people were questioning, is it really the case that slavery in the Old Testament should not be translated slavery, that it should be translated bond servant? Where do you come on the practice of Old Testament slavery?
Yeah, well, I think there are several issues here. One is the question of translation. The other is the question of the actual institution. And I think the third question is where that fits in the salvation history of the Bible. Starting with the word. So the word eved occurs about 800 times in the Bible. And very few English translations translate even a majority of those as slave. In fact, I can't think of an English translation that does that. The majority it will translate as something like servant, because it's used there in language where they say, what does my Lord say to his servant, and so on. And so my argument is partly to point out that the habit of translating this as slave is a comparatively new thing. Now, translation's just inherently difficult to try and bring everything across. And what we've got to realize is we have a cultural expectation in our society that if someone is a slave, you call them a slave. Now, in a slave-keeping society like North America, before the Civil War, typically people wouldn't call their slaves slaves. They'd call them their Negro or their lad or their boy. They wouldn't say my slave. So we've got to distinguish between what the person is and what the word says. So my argument ties together with the fact that I prefer literal and consistent translations, would be that I want people to have the word servant for all 800 of those occurrences, or they can have slave for all 800 of those occurrences, but then we would have to translate the dialogues that go, what does my Lord say to his slave, like that, right the way through. I don't care which, I slightly prefer the servant one, but either way, I don't want us to pick some of these occurrences and say they're bad occurrences and they're slave, and other occurrences and say they're okay. We're talking about this, the Messiah being the servant of the Lord. I say either we do them all slave or we do them all servant. So if you're going to go Moses is the slave of the Lord, that's fine. We can handle that, because then we can explain in teaching and preaching what the concept is that's going on. The idea that everyone is subservient, and that we all belong to God, or we have it as servant everywhere. What I don't want to do is have some of the occurrences as slave and some as servant.
Okay.
So that's on the translation. Then you've got what's the institution, and again it varies. And I'm not saying there was no overlap between what happened in the Old Testament and slavery. Obviously, you should have an understanding that everyone ultimately belongs to God. So that should qualify it over against an absolute chattel slavery. But I'm not saying that Old Testament people always kept their servants in good conditions. I am saying the law says if you so much as strike the tooth out of your servant, they have to go free of obligation. So that's obviously pretty different from typical chattel slavery situations. I also think that it's right for us to understand much of the law as permissive rather than saying this is a good idea. So Jesus teaches us when you're asked about divorce, it's allowed in Moses' law, but go back to the beginning, and the narrative suggests this is a bad idea. Again, the same thing we can do with polygamy, same thing we can do with slavery. Back in Genesis 2 and 3, there's no slavery. First time someone said to be servant of someone else is in response to Noah's drunkenness, where we have the curse on Canaan, which then gets worked out in the Bible. as the Gibeonites become servants. So that's all part of the Bible narrative. And then the third point is, what's the Bible doing in the story as a whole? And I think the Bible in the story as a whole is setting up a system where God privileges one particular people group, one particular nation, in order for them to be priests to the entire world, in order for them to be teachers to the entire world. So one of the things you would have in our terms is discrimination, where they're allowed to be more favorable, they're told to be more favorable to Israelites than they are to people outside. Now, from our categories, where we're thinking about an egalitarian world, that simply doesn't work. But within God's mind, Ephesians 2 and 3 basically tell us that it was God's plan all along that the non-Jews and the Jews, or the non-Jews in Israel, should be one body. And so what you have in the Old Testament is a period of teaching the human race, which is going on for particular purposes. So it's not that Christians have to understand that and say, wow, isn't that a great way to run a country today?
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so that I take it is how you would deal with places like Leviticus 25. Let me just read out a few of those verses. From verse 29, it says, "If one of your countrymen becomes poor among you and sells himself to you, do not make him work as a slave. He is to be treated as a hired worker or a temporary resident among you. He is to work for you until the year of Jubilee. Then he and his children are to be released." And then from verse 44, it says, "Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can will them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly." So there is that distinction between...
Yeah, and how does it continue just then? You must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly?
Yes, you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. If an alien or a temporary resident among you becomes rich, and one of your countrymen becomes poor and sells himself to the alien living among you, or to a member of the alien's clan, he retains the right of redemption after he has sold himself. One of his relatives...
Yeah, I was thinking about, maybe it's that verse before, where it says, "They are my servants." Let's get it right. Okay. It's in Leviticus 25. It specifically says, verse 42, "They are my servants, which I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondmen." Now, the thing about that is, that's why does the translation use servants at that point and slave at other points? The logic of it is, it's the same word. We've got to keep that. And so the Israelites belong as, if you like, they're servants or slaves of God. And then they have others under them. Now, it's not saying this is good, because I would say if there were no fall and there were no sin, there would be none of this sort of stuff at all. And when Christ comes in the New Testament, he says, those who come to him, everyone is his slave, but also they are free from sin. The other alternative is to be a slave of sin. And so you can't avoid being a slave. So part of the thing I'd want to do is I'd want to talk about the mythology of modern freedom, how for the last 25 centuries this idea of freedom has grown up. So we now imagine that we can sort of be absolutely free of any constraint. It's absolutely crazy, and impossible. And so I want to critique that, so that people understand that, the ultimate aim is not that we should be free of any obligation. The ultimate aim is that we should be under good authority. And God is good authority, who actually will give his children a right to rule under him, which is an amazing thing.
So famously, Moses says to Pharaoh, "Let my people go that they might serve me." It is liberation from Egypt, but it is therefore it is slavery to the Lord, which is our truth.
Yeah. So in fact, the language of liberation, there is no language of liberation in all of Exodus, I would say. So people read the word liberation in, but you go through and look where it is. And the word, the Hebrew root ayin beit dalet, which is the serve root, occurs more for what they are going to than what they're coming from in Egypt, in the narrative. And so the other thing people do is they ignore Genesis 47. Genesis 47 is very, very clear that during the famine, Joseph buys up all of the land of the Egyptians and eventually buys up all of the Egyptians for Pharaoh. So the Egyptians are, if you like, Pharaoh's slaves. And then in Exodus, it comes along and says, I'm going to visit my judgment on Pharaoh and on his servants. That's the phrase that comes up again and again, on Pharaoh and his servants. And his servants are not the Israelites. His servants are his henchmen. In fact, the only time in the entire narrative the word servants or slaves is used of the Israelites is when the foreman of the Israelites, in other words, those who are collaborating with the Egyptians, are trying to argue for a better deal with Pharaoh. And they say, well, we're your servants. In other words, it's to try and argue for a special treatment. So in fact, I want to say that in the language of Exodus, they're not servants. Now, in the language of Deuteronomy, it will say you were a servant in the land of Egypt, and that's fine. But it's just this idea that they are servants in Egypt, and then they come out from being servants, and they're no longer servants, is completely wrong. The Passover is specifically said to be their work, their service. So you're either doing harsh work in Egypt, or you're doing the Passover work. You know, I know which I prefer to be doing.
Sure, and you've got to serve somebody, and therefore it's a question of you do belong to somebody already. Who are you going to belong to? And yet, so there is this differentiation though. So that the Gentiles can be possessed in a different way to the way that the Israelites are possessed. They can be as property.
So what I'd want to say there is, obviously, I don't think that everything that happened or everything that was allowed in the Old Testament was good. So the Old Testament allows divorce, doesn't say it's good. So I'd want to say I see that as regulatory. You know, so when you've got something like this, I would want to say there's no single answer, but there's a whole number of facets that need to be considered. Some of them are our false cultural expectations, you know, and some of them are in our language, and some of them are just understanding what the Old Testament is. I don't think the Old Testament is saying this is ideal. I think that what it is doing is that there's a narrative of how this work comes about. I mean, the way I look at it is God blesses the man and the woman in Genesis 1, therefore they can't be cursed. So in Genesis 3, he curses the ground. In Genesis 5, Lamech says that Noah's going to comfort them out of the ground, which God cursed. In Genesis 9, he becomes a man of the ground, and what comes out of the ground is the fruit of the vine. Now, remember, there's a curse in there, and the fruit of the vine definitely gives you comfort. Wine gives you comfort, but there's also a sting in it, the curse. And so that curse is passed on to, can't go to Shem, Ham, and Japheth because they've already been blessed. So it has to go to Ham's son, Canaan. That's how the Canaanites get cursed. And he's said to be, Genesis 9:25, servant of servants. And that's going to get worked out in the history of the Bible so that some Canaanites, namely the Gibeonites, become servants. Now, if you trace that all the way back, there's nothing in the text that says this isn't as a result of human sin. It's a result of Noah doing things wrong. It's as a result of the sin in the garden. So all of this is an outworking of sin. There's nothing in it which says, hey, God thinks this is really cool and this is okay. In fact, I'd say the Bible narrative says quite different.
Is there a parallel here with sort of polygamy and that sort of thing? You know, a Christian might sort of read the entirety of the scriptures and derive from that marriage is one woman with one man for life. And then someone just with that flat view looks at the scriptures and says, well, what about this polygamous activity? What about and I guess you'd say, well, actually those narratives are actually meant to be showing us that this was not the ideal situation at all. and you need to read the entire narrative flow. And then from that entire narrative flow, yes, you can derive some kind of universal principle, like one man, one woman for life. And would you say by parallel, you can kind of do that on the issue of slavery?
Absolutely. So you know, with polygamy, first time it comes up in Genesis 4, which is a fairly shady context, and it's a murderer anyway. Next time it comes up, Abraham is doubting. It gives rise to family conflict. In fact, you could argue the greatest, you know, inter-ethnic conflict on earth currently, you know, all comes from that. You go on with Jacob, you know, tricking his father, therefore tricked by his father-in-law, results in polygamy. The kids are trying to murder Joseph. You know, it's a whole story of chaos. Same in David's family, same in Solomon's family. So I want to say every time you get polygamy, it's telling you this is a really bad idea. The narrative is doing that. And I would want to say that the narrative in Exodus portrays the subjugation of Israel as a very bad thing. And the narrative of the Bible also subverts the idea that Israel's just great and can do what it wants. Because, of course, when Israel becomes idolatrous, they are ultimately cast from the land and have to serve other nations. So, you know, service can be seen as part of judgment on sin. And it's, you know, Bible's pretty clear that sin's a bad thing.
Mm-hmm. And so coming through into the New Testament, some people want to object, you know, why doesn't the Apostle Paul write a treatise against slavery? Why does he just say, serve your masters as though you're serving Christ?
Yeah, well, firstly, he is emphasizing the relationship with Christ as primary and saying you shouldn't fear your masters, you just fear God. Now, of course, he can't change the political system, but neither could he say to masters that you have to free all of your servants. And the reason why is they wouldn't necessarily all become legally free anyway, because masters couldn't just free all of their servants in every legal situation. And sometimes you'd disadvantage them by freeing them. If you free them before 30, they can't become a citizen. But what he does do is he says, look, we've got a new society. And in this society, you're brothers and sisters. That's why you have the holy kiss, to symbolize that you're part of a single family. And that it's an egalitarian family under Jesus Christ, who is Lord, or if you like, Master. He is the Master Jesus Christ. In fact, you can't become a believer without confessing that he is Master. That is the absolutely essential thing. So every master, every servant has to acknowledge his masterhood, and that we are all brothers and sisters under him. And that's the condition. So obviously, he does say, don't become slaves of others if you can avoid it. We don't want to do that. We belong to Christ. But he can't simply abolish the Roman slavery system like that, but he can say we should treat others as Christ treated us, with love. And I think that basically abolishes things. The holy kiss is quite a scandalous thing. The idea that Jew should kiss Gentile, or that master should kiss slave, completely against the whole system there. It's like fraternizing across ranks in the army. It's, you know, just very disapproved of. And so that tangible way of portraying believers as on one level is there.
Would you agree with Tom Holland describes Paul's teaching as like a depth charge that was sort of released in the first century that worked its way out in the politics of the West in a way that was almost inevitable that slavery would be overturned because of it?
Yeah, yes. I mean, I do think, of course, you know, we've got plenty of modern slavery today, and the thing is, the principles of the gospel undermine any claim that anyone would have to ownership of someone else, because you realize you're there under God. How it's going to work out in a political system, I think over time you can see the value, the idea that everyone is in the image of God works itself out. It undermines slavery, any idea that people are just mere things. And so when slavery has managed to thrive, it's because there have been emphases against those gospel ideas. So, for instance, that there was a racism often associated with the idea that different races had originated at different times in human history, which people tried to lay onto the Bible, which allowed a kind of Christianity to survive alongside slavery in North America. But that was because people weren't really following the biblical text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And just one last question on the slavery issue. I guess so many Christians are tempted to simply take sort of a universal declaration of human rights to be the same thing as what the Old Testament, what the scriptures in general are kind of talking about. But it seems to me like you have a slight resistance to that, to say that actually our modern post-Enlightenment notion of freedom is quite an individualistic kind of idea, as though I don't belong to anybody. And so perhaps the Bible challenges our modern conceptions of freedom in the first place, would you say?
Yeah, so I think that the natural tendency today is to make every individual into a little god. And so you have, billions of little gods going around the planet, each asserting their sovereignty. And sometimes there'll be clashes about their claims, and that has to be resolved in the courts. And that's why we have, the courts taking more and more things. I would want to say that it's not helpful for us to think of things like that. It's helpful for us to think of ourselves in families and in societies and communities, but also to think of ourselves as under God. I think that's important. So language of rights can be helpful, but I think sometimes it can get made absolute, as if we inherently deserve something, rather than this is a way of trying to capture the dignity of each individual as of infinite value made by God.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very well said. Brilliant. Can I just talk to you about your new book coming out? So, Can You Trust the Gospels? I've heard you say that it's in many ways a sort of a distillation of some of your life's work in terms of getting people to trust the New Testament documents, the Gospels in particular. How have you seen your life kind of heading towards this kind of publication, this kind of book?
Well, I suppose I began speaking about the reliability of the Bible publicly in about age 25. I'm 48 now. And so it's been quite a while. And in some senses, the way I structure this book is the same as my very first talk all those years ago. Not every part of it, some bits of it are much more recent, but I've been developing it, trying out in many countries, many audiences. And I wanted to make a brief account for people who know nothing about the Bible, about why you should trust the Gospels, in a form that could be simply given out to people who want to have those questions answered. So people who've studied humanities at university will be very happy with the idea that information can be handed down over long periods of time in manuscripts. But say someone studied engineering, they may not know that. And so I need to do the very basic things, and I do that in the book, of how do we know that any of the Greek and Latin literature that's handed down to us is at all reliably handed down. Those are the steps I want to be in place. And I also want to put it in terms of, the title is, Can We Trust the Gospels? I'm not trying to prove historicity so much as show trustworthiness. And I'd say every single one of us, every day, decides to trust our lives into various things, when we eat food made by other people and so on. And so I'm asking people to use the skills that they normally use to decide trustworthiness and apply those to the Gospels. And I think the Gospels come out very well as worthy of trust.
Yes, we're always listening to the witness of others. We rely on the witnesses of others to get through every single day. Do you encounter a lot of people who, when you say, oh, the history of the Gospels is better than the history of Caesar's Gallic Wars, or it's better than the historical evidence we have for Homer's Iliad and things like that? I encounter quite a lot of people who say, yeah, well, I don't trust those either. If so, what do you say to them?
Yeah, well, I think that when people are presenting that sort of apologetic, It's a bit like the game Top Trumps,
Mhm.
my one's better than yours. So our Bible's got more copies than your book, whatever it is. But let's remember there are more copies of yesterday's Sun newspaper, than there are manuscripts of the Bible. Does that make the Sun newspaper yesterday more reliable? I don't think so. So I think we want to avoid apologetics by superlative.
Mhm.
The Bible's not super reliable because it sold more than any other book. Because it was reliable before it had sold more than any other book. So I'd want to say, what I prefer to do is argue from consistency. So I'd say you already trust X, Y, or Z. I don't know what it is, but the people trust various things. Let's find out what they already trust. How much do they check something before they retweet it or believe it or whatever it is? And what you find is actually in many areas, people have quite low levels of checking information before they trust it. And then when they come to this area to do with the Bible, they suddenly have a whole new set of criteria. And so I want to probe that and say, well, why is that? Because I think, one of the things that Jesus says about, not judging others is whatever measure you use on others will be used back on you. And I think that in the final judgment, one thing that will not happen is no one will go away from it saying it's unfair, because God wants to demonstrate to everyone on earth his complete fairness. So one of the things I think that really shows our moral corruptness is the inconsistent standards we use. I mean, we see it in politics, how, the other side does something and instantly we criticize them. Our side does it and we say, well, this is happening in life all of the time. And so this is what we need to raise with evidence. And my argument would be that people would trust all sorts of things in life as historical things with far less evidence than the Gospels. So that's the first point. I think one of the things that makes people wary about trusting the Gospels is the miraculous. And also, let's face it, the fact that if the Gospels are true, then we don't own our lives. So we can't claim that we're neutral in this. In fact, according to the Gospels and the Bible as a whole, we're actually turning away from God. So all of those things need to be brought into account. But I would say, plenty of evidence for trustworthiness of the Gospels. If someone says, well, you don't trust Caesar's Gallic Wars, fine, but I'm sure they trust something. They don't find people are just pragmatic in terms of thinking. They trust reviews on Amazon, or they trust things that they make life decisions about, invest resources and time about based on trust. How do they do that?
That's very interesting, because as you're bringing evidence to bear, you're not treating the unbeliever as though they are a rational decision-making individual who's just calmly and coolly collating the data and making up their mind in a neutral way. You're actually pointing out, hey, here is this evidence, but are you noticing the way that you are biased towards? Are you noticing your reasoning?
So in the book, I don't try and prod particular people about their the things. I think that's to be done in a personal context, and at the same time, we've got to admit our own biases. But what I would hope would happen is that by God's grace, people would, as they look at this evidence, think about their reaction to it, and if they are having to do all sorts of mental gymnastics to try and explain it away, that I hope that might say to them, hey, there's something wrong here. Because one of the things that I came to as I wrote my book is sitting back after I'd written my arguments out and thinking how simple they were. I wasn't having to manipulate the data and the evidence a lot. They really were the simplest argument for how the gospel writers have all the knowledge of the land and the geography and where the land goes up and down and the traveling distances and all this sort of stuff, is that they had really good quality information from the land. They'd either been there or had really extended conversations with people who'd been there. I just think that's the simplest explanation. You can look at the other ones. And so you can go with that time and time again. I mean, you can always explain something away. You can explain away the resurrection. You can explain away whatever you like. But then I would say the argument that Jesus actually rose from the dead just explains such a lot in one go. You suddenly start understanding how all the scripture fits together. You start understanding prophecy. You make sense of this. Anything else, and I'm going to have to constantly come up with scenarios that explain this and that.
Yes,
You know,
in an ad hoc way. Yeah.
It's going to be a lot of work, a lot of ad hoc. Yeah.
Yes. Interesting. So, yeah, the explanatory power of the Bible is true, Jesus is Lord, he rose from the dead, has a simplicity to it that hopefully is a compelling witness. Yeah. Brilliant. And have you seen, final question, have you seen that since age 25, you've been sort of getting this material out there? Where have you seen this really kind of engaging with people and opening eyes and perhaps seeing lives changed?
Well, I mean, certainly, people have come to faith. What I'd say is a lot of times you actually see that Christians who previously had doubts and uncertainties are seeing a way through that. Actually, I think a lot of people in churches are very under-equipped, underprepared to articulate their faith. I think people are using their brains far more in their work typically than they are in their church. And that doesn't seem to me a good way around to do things. So I think there's a lot of work, but I do think there's opportunities to help people realize that their brains can be used to confirm the truth of the Gospels.
Yes, and as they rely and lean on and stand on the scriptures are solid enough to hold them. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I hope the book sells squillions. It's available from Crossway. When is it out, Peter? It's
out the 30th of November. So just in time for Christmas.
Absolutely. Great Christmas present. Put it in every stocking. Brilliant.
Great.
Williams, thank you so much.
Great chat. Okay. God bless.